Let's do a practice question on the endocrine system. So this one says, researchers investigating the endocrine responses to stress measured circulating hormone levels in 3 groups of participants exposed to acute stressors. Group A exhibited increased concentrations of cortisol, Group B showed elevated epinephrine and norepinephrine, and Group C demonstrated a rise in plasma insulin. Which of the following statements best distinguishes between the classes of hormones represented in groups A, B, and C? So, without even looking at the answer choices, let's think about it, right? We have these 3 distinct hormones. And one of the things that jumps out at me is that they all belong to different classes. So cortisol, right, this is actually a steroid hormone. This is a steroid. And so it's derived from cholesterol, and cortisol is produced in the adrenal cortex, and it's released in response to stress, okay? Even though here they're also saying that these other ones can be released in response to stress, okay? Now, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which I'll just abbreviate as E plus NE, so these are catecholamines, right? The other catecholamine is actually dopamine. But basically, the catecholamines are derived from amino acids, and specifically from tyrosine, the amino acid tyrosine. And these are water-soluble hormones. And these are also stress hormones, but they mediate more acute stress. And they are released from the adrenal medulla, which is kind of deep to the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. And lastly, we have insulin. Now, insulin is that hormone that's released in response to high glucose blood levels, and its aim is to reduce glucose blood levels. Now, insulin is produced by beta cells, which are found in the pancreas. Okay, and while epinephrine and norepinephrine are amino acid derived hormones or amine hormones, insulin is actually a protein hormone. So this is a protein, or a protein slash peptide. Really, it's actually a peptide, but we'll just put it in that class. Now, cortisol is a steroid, and then epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are actually amino acid derived hormones, right? So these are 3 distinct classes, and we know that there's going to be some differences between them. Now, an important thing to realize is that both the catecholamines and insulin, being either peptide derived or amino acid derived, these are water soluble. So these 2 do have a similarity. They're soluble in H2O. But this is not water soluble, so it's lipid soluble. Okay, so most likely the difference is going to be here. So let's take a look. So A says cortisol requires a membrane-bound receptor for action. Well, we're going to stop there because remember that the lipid-soluble hormones, they do not bind membrane receptors. They instead diffuse through the membrane of the cell and bind intracellular receptors. So this is incorrect. Now B, epinephrine and norepinephrine are steroid-derived hormones. Well, no, that's not true because like we said, they are actually amino acid derived. And then C, insulin circulates freely in the blood, whereas cortisol requires a carrier protein. And that sounds correct because these are valid statements. Insulin, being a peptide hormone, actually does not require a carrier protein. It's water soluble already. But cortisol is a steroid hormone, and so it does require a carrier protein since it's normally lipid soluble. So C is correct, but let's also rule out D. All 3 hormones act through intracellular receptors, and that's not true. Only cortisol does because it's the only one that's lipid soluble. The others do not. They bind to membrane receptors and activate signaling cascades.